Thank you. Yeah, it's a great pleasure and thrill to be moderating our next panel on re-enchanting our relationship with nature. So, yeah, this is a topic that is close to my heart. I've had a lifelong, I guess, connection to enchantment with nature. Shall I go down here? And yeah, it seems right now at this time that we find ourselves as a species, as a civilization on this planet, this is something very, very important. So we have conclusive scientific evidence now that we are orchestrating the sixth great mass extinction of life on this planet single-handedly, and that ecological degradation, loss of species, is accelerating at an unprecedented rate. And without a global mobilization, ecological mobilization on the scale of the Second World War, we are in deep, deep trouble. So if the cold hard facts and the evidence is not enough to motivate change at the scale and speed that it needs to, what's it going to take? And yeah, I see we have two options. We essentially keep going along our current path, and we will make a mess of things to the scale that it will hugely impact our lives, our livelihoods, our well-being as a species on this planet. And then I think, knowing what I sort of know of human nature, we will act. But I fear it might be too late then. It might be too little too late. So that is one possible trajectory. And another possible trajectory I see is potentially consciousness change. We redeem ourselves before we destroy ourselves. And part of this, I think, will come through a re-enchantment with nature. And so I hope we can get across in this following panel discussion, there are many different ways of doing this, of going about this. This is not a one-size-fit-all approach. One of my interests, my background is in ecology, which is the science of living systems, the interconnection of living systems. But I'm also interested in psychedelics and their potential to facilitate connectedness to nature. Psychedelics are certainly a pathway to gaining a re-enchantment with nature, or increasing one's wonderment and connection to nature. So, yeah, I would like now to introduce my four very interesting panelists. We've got a very, very interesting smorgasbord of people here who all have their very own sort of pathway towards nature re-enchantment. So we hope to get across. There are many different ways here. And this enchantment with nature, this is something that is deeply important for our health and well-being. I see this like nature re-enchantment, nature connectedness. It is a pathway for us to become the best version of ourselves. But not only that, it's our connection to nature is the strongest predictor of pro-environmental behavior as well. So not only is it intrinsically, inherently good for us, but it motivates concern and care. It externalizes our awareness beyond the individual self onto to the wider world. So, yeah, I'd like to introduce my four guests. Does anyone know where my little notes are? Sorry. Cool, thank you. So, yes, I'd like to introduce Joe Marchant, who has just been speaking here. And so Joe has written books on the mind-body connection. pure, and most recently the human cosmos, about our ancient cultural connection to the stars and the cosmos. And yeah, I'm going to keep sort of intro short. Joe's going to be speaking on the physical and psychological benefits of our connection with the cosmos. And I'm really interested to hear more about this as well, because I've kind of wondered myself the effects of being interested in nature connection, the effects of living in cities with light pollution. What effect is that having on people's psychology, being cut off from the cosmos, from the stars? Like, that's a diminished sense of awe and connection to something bigger. So that's going to have big effects, irrespective of just being cut off from nature in an urban environment. So I'm looking forward to hearing more. I'd like to introduce Chris Park. Chris is a druid, a bard and a storyteller, and he is a keeper of bees. And Chris will be speaking on bees, honey, and apitherapy, a druid's eye on the seasons. I would like to introduce Bridget Nichols. Bridget was raised on an animal sanctuary and is descended from pirates, apparently. She created Pestival, an international festival about the art of being an insect, of which over 200,000 people attended, which is pretty cool. And it won the Observer Ethical Award for Conservation in 2010. And yes, Bridget will be speaking on rediscovery of the integrity of the natural world, insects, celebration, and healing. And so lastly, I would like to introduce Skeena Rathor. Skeena she's the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and co-leads the Vision Sensing Group, the spiritual hub of XR. She's also an elected councillor on Shroud District Council, as well as a national spokesperson for XR, and has appeared widely on TV and radio. And Skeena will be speaking on the re-enchantment of the heart and its soil in a transformation. And so now I'm going to hand you over to my speakers. So yes, Joe, if you'd like to kick things off, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam. So I want to talk about the importance of reconnecting with the cosmos, what's going on beyond our planet, which we already touched on in the last session. So often when we think about reconnecting with nature, we're thinking about landscapes, wildlife, forests, oceans, and we don't think so much about what's going on above our heads. And just to give a little bit of background on where I'm coming from for anyone who wasn't in the last session. So there are a lot of people here who can share traditional knowledge, and my perspective is different to that. I started life as a scientist. I have a PhD in genetics. Now I'm an author and journalist, and I'm particularly interested in what science can tell us today about reconnecting with ourselves and with our environment. So a few years ago, I had a book called Cure about the role that the mind plays in medicine, what science says about how the mind influences the body. And then the reason I'm here now is my new book called The Human Cosmos, which is coming out next week, which takes a similar perspective but zooms out to look at how we relate to the universe through history and today. And I really think that right now we desperately need to reconnect, not just with the earth, but with the sky as well. So since the dawn of humanity, people have been looking to the stars. They've seen the constellations circling around the celestial poles, the glittering river of the Milky Way, the intricate dance of the sun and moon, the wanderings of the planets. And this was crucial for everyday life, both practically and spiritually. It's a view that was shared by every society through history until now, of course. I mentioned briefly before that instead of thousands of stars in the sky, we now see just a few dozen in cities. There was a global survey of light pollution recently that found that most of us can no longer see the Milky Way. So our view of the cosmos that we're part of is literally being wiped away, and in how we live as well. Technologies such as watches and sat-navs tell us when and where we are. artificial lighting and heating, intensive farming, air travel, it all means that the passing of the days and seasons are far less significant now than they ever have been in the past. And in one sense, of course, we are reaching further into the cosmos than ever before, and that's with modern physics and astronomy and exquisitely powerful telescopes. So we now understand more about the composition and workings of the universe than ever before. But what I think we're really missing is that not the third person objective facts, but our first person subjective experience of the stars, our direct personal connection to the universe. And that's important both for our bodies and for our minds. So just to take our bodies first, scientists are increasingly realizing the extent to which cosmic cycles are literally built into biology. So molecular clocks inside cells guide and synchronize the activity of all life on Earth, and we know most about the 24-hour daily rhythms that follow the movements of the sun. And we know that the movements of the sun are literally encoded and anticipated in our DNA. So there's dozens of clock genes that encode a complex network of proteins that sort of steadily pulse inside our cells once every day. And external signals from the sun, sunlight, temperature, then nudge or entrain those rhythms to keep them in perfect time with the sun. And these sun clocks are found in every kind of organisms, from bacteria to people, so much so that they're seen as a defining feature of life. We know that biology is not static, it's cyclic. In people, the main signal is sunlight, which we detect in cells in the retina of our eyes, and the information about the timing of sunrise and sunset goes to a central pacemaker in the brain, which then coordinates secondary clocks all through the body, and then that determines the workings of pretty much every biological function. So there's our sleep patterns as an obvious one, but also things like body temperature, blood pressure, kidney function, digestion, immune responses, even cell division and the replication of our DNA. In medicine, medical conditions tend to undergo a sort of daily fluctuation in their occurrence and their symptoms. The time of day can determine how you'll respond to a drug or an infection, even whether a meal, exactly the same meal that you eat, will cause you to gain or lose weight. So we know that the sun is kind of embedded at every aspect of our biology. We know less about the moon, and this is a case of where biologists haven't really taken the moon very seriously, but now that they're starting to look, they're finding the influence of the moon everywhere in coastal species. Often their daily rhythms are shaped by the tides rather than the sun. But even inland, predators like owls, wolves, and snakes will hunt by moonlight. The phase of the moon influences everything from when whippoorwill chicks hatch to when wildebeest are born to the flowering of the Peruvian apple cactus. And we also know that in aquatic species, at least, there are molecular moon clocks. So the activity of hundreds of genes cycles with the phase of the moon. So in these species, at least, biologists haven't looked in other species yet, their biological clocks at a fundamental level are tuned not just to the sun, but also to the moon. In humans, the influence of the moon, there's a lot of traditional beliefs about this. For scientists, it's quite a controversial topic. So back in the 1960s and 70s, there were quite a lot of studies that claimed to show a link between the phase of the moon and things like occurrence of violent events, timing of menstruation, of births. More recent studies tend not to show an effect. Some scientists are very skeptical. They say we shouldn't even study this any further. There's no possible way in which the moon could influence human biology. But others say that it's not actually surprising that we don't see that effect in more recent studies because we're no longer exposed to natural patterns of moonlight. And actually, now we know that there are genetic moon clocks in lots of species, from fish to coral, so they must date from very early in evolution. So it wouldn't actually be that surprising if they are in humans as well. I just wanted to say as well as the light from the sun and the moon, there are also some hints in the research that we're also sensitive to magnetic fields. We know that particularly in the Earth's magnetic field, there are daily ripples that are caused by the movements of the sun and the moon. And this is it's quite early days for the research, but we know that lots of species can detect those tiny magnetic changes by a variety of mechanisms. And there are some studies suggesting now that humans are sensitive to those as well. So when we disrupt all of these rhythms, that can have devastating effects. So light pollution now affects more than a fifth of the Earth's land area, with really just disrupting all aspects of wildlife, so much so that in 2018, scientists suggested that we should see light pollution as a global threat on a par with climate change. In humans as well, increasing separation from the sun has been described as a ticking time bomb with health implications, including insomnia, depression, but also heart disease, obesity, and cancer. So it's from a physical point of view, we really do need to be in touch with the movements of the sun and the moon in order to be healthy. These are not just distant events happening up in the sky, they're affecting us now. So that's bodies. In terms of minds, we've known since the 1960s that when people go up into space, for example, that can have a profound psychological effect. So the Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield, for example, when he went on his first spacewalk, he said that he was attacked by raw beauty that stopped his thought, and it taught him the power of the presence of the world. And this is the kind of thing that astronaut after astronaut comes back from space saying. So these are hard-headed, technically trained people, and yet they come back poetic, passionate, with a completely different perspective on our planet. Often they come back talking about the Earth as a sort of precious, fragile haven. They often describe it as a living organism, and they come back determined to protect it. And they also talk about human wars and conflicts, and talk about how sort of trivial they are. So my favourite quote on this, which you might know, is from Edgar Mitchell, who flew to the moon on the Apollo 14 mission. And he said, "From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck, drag him 250,000 miles out and say, 'Look at that, you son of a bitch.'" So when these astronauts see the Earth from outside, they don't see it as an inert backdrop to our daily lives. They see it as a precious living force in its own right. And they see themselves, they don't see their own nation or identity, but they see all of humanity as inhabitants of the same planet. So psychologists have been looking, I was just going to say, we can't all go into space, obviously, but on Earth as well, when we look at the stars, but especially on a truly dark night, people also describe really profound psychological experiences. So they commonly will talk about feeling lifted up, immortal, connected with the universe. The nature writer Robert Macfarlane talks about a feeling of that your feet might latch off from the Earth and you might plummet upwards into space. And this is an effect known as celestial vaulting. So yeah, psychologists have been looking at all these different kinds of experiences of the cosmos from astronauts and stargazers. And they explain them, as Sam was saying, as experiences of the emotion awe. So awe is that jaw-dropping feeling that you get when you're confronted with something that's vast, that dwarfs you, that you can't explain. And they're able to induce like mild awe, at least in studies, by asking people to gaze up at tall trees or look at huge dinosaur skeletons. But most often they just ask people to look at the stars. I mean, there's nothing more vast than the cosmos. And it turns out that awe has some really surprising and powerful effects on us. So it makes people more curious, more creative. It seems to shake us out of habitual patterns of thinking, and makes people more focused on the world around them. A dose of awe makes people happier and less stressed, even weeks later. Also, what's interesting is that people, after feeling awe, sign their names smaller, and they estimate their own physical size as smaller. And the brain scans show that activity in the default mode network, the pattern of activity in the brain that's associated with the sense of self is reduced. As well as all the personal benefits as well, there are, all seems to make us nicer people. So people describe themselves as feeling more connected to other people and to the planet. They make more ethical decisions. They are more likely to make sacrifices to help others. They care less about money, more about the environment. They feel as if they have more time. So all of this has led to the idea that awe sort of triggers this small self. It shrinks our sense of self. So instead of seeing ourselves and our daily concerns as sort of everything, as being all important, we're able to have a wider focus. We see ourselves as just one small part of a greater connected whole. Extreme experiences of awe, it seems they don't just shrink our sense of self, they can dissolve it completely. So an example is Edgar Mitchell, when he was flying home from the moon. You're nodding, you know all this. He described the universe, the whole universe as conscious, and he felt that he was physically and mentally extending out into it. And this type of awareness is known as a transcendent state. And it seems that gazing at the stars is one really powerful route to that kind of awareness. But there are others as well. So similar states of awareness are described during spiritual experiences and meditation, for example. And these have been quite hard to study scientifically, but in the last few years, scientists have been triggering them using psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin. And I think you're going to be talking a bit more about this tomorrow. Yes. But just briefly, these drugs bind to serotonin receptors in the brain, and they seem to provide a fast-track route to these kinds of experiences of awe. And volunteers